Vladimir Putin landed in Beijing on May 19, 2026, with a military honor guard waiting, children waving Russian and Chinese flags, and a red carpet rolled out at Tiananmen Square. It looked powerful. It looked like equals meeting. It looked like Russia arriving in force. But here's the detail every Western outlet completely missed. Putin was not received by China's vice president. He was not received by a senior Politburo member. He was received by the foreign minister, Wang Yi, a protocol diplomat. 1 week earlier, Donald Trump got China's vice president on the tarmac. That single detail, that one quiet, devastating difference in protocol, tells you more about the real balance of power between Russia and China than any joint statement, any pipeline deal, or any photograph of two leaders shaking hands at the Great Hall of the People. Russia thinks it's in a partnership. China knows it owns a client. If you've been watching this channel, you know we don't do headlines. We do what's underneath the headlines. If you're new here, subscribe right now, because what we're breaking down today is not just geopolitics. This is energy markets, supply chains, military alliances, and the quiet restructuring of global power happening in real time while most people are still reading the press release. Drop a comment right now. Do you think Putin is China's equal partner or China's dependent? Let's see where this audience stands. And stay until the end, because the Ukraine piece of this story and what Xi privately told Trump about Putin just days earlier, that changes everything. Let's go back to February 24th, 2022. Putin ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and within weeks, the world's largest coordinated sanctions regime in history came crashing down on Russia. European gas contracts canceled, SWIFT access severed, Western companies evacuating Moscow overnight. Russia needed a lifeline, and Beijing answered. China didn't do it loudly. China didn't announce it. China simply started buying Russian oil, Russian gas, Russian coal at discounted prices, on China's terms, in Chinese currency. Responsible consumer. That is literally the phrase a Russian presidential aide used this week to describe China's role in buying Russian energy. Responsible consumer. Not strategic partner, not equal ally, a consumer. Buying discounted goods from a seller who has no other buyers. Russia's oil exports to China grew 35% in the first quarter of 2026 alone. Not from a low base, from an already historically high level. And two-way trade between the two countries hit $245 billion in 2024. More than double what it was in 2020. That sounds like a booming partnership, until you look at what that trade actually consists of. Russia exports oil, gas, coal, and timber, raw commodities. China exports finished electronics, machinery, consumer goods, and the dual-use technology components that keep Russia's military-industrial complex functioning under sanctions. One side exports what comes out of the ground. The other side exports what human intelligence creates. That is not a partnership of equals. That is an extractive economic relationship, and Russia walked into it with no other option. Here is the number almost nobody is putting in their headlines: $367 billion. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 through this year, China has purchased $367 billion worth of Russian oil and gas. That is not aid. That is not charity. That is China strategically locking Russia into a dependency relationship while paying below-market prices for every single barrel. Let that sit for a second. China knew the West would sanction Russia. China knew Russia would need buyers. China moved first, bought deep, and priced it at a discount. Every purchase since 2022 has been a strategic chess move dressed as a commercial transaction. And now here is the hook within the hook. That $367 billion in purchases didn't create Russian leverage over China. It created Chinese leverage over Russia. Russia's federal budget is now estimated to derive over 30% of its revenues from energy exports. The majority of those exports go to China. If China reduced its purchases even modestly, not stopped, just reduced, Russia faces a fiscal crisis in the middle of a war it cannot afford to lose politically. Beijing understands this perfectly, which is why when Putin arrived in Beijing on May 19th, he came carrying a very specific ask that has been on Russia's agenda for years: the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. The Power of Siberia 2 is a proposed 1,600-mile natural gas pipeline that would run from Russia's Arctic gas fields down through Mongolia and into northern China. If built, it would carry up to 50 billion cubic meters of Russian natural gas into China annually. To put that in context, that is roughly equivalent to what Russia was exporting to Europe before the Ukraine war destroyed those relationships. Russia lost its most profitable gas market when Europe cut ties. Siberia 2 is Putin's attempt to redirect that supply east and replace that lost revenue. Putin said it himself 10 days before arriving in Beijing. He said Moscow and Beijing had reached a very substantial step forward in cooperation in the oil and gas sector. He said practically all the key issues had been agreed upon. He said if the details could be finalized during this visit, he would be extremely pleased. Extremely pleased. That is not the language of an equal partner negotiating a mutual deal. That is the language of a supplicant hoping his patron will finally say yes. Because here is what mainstream coverage completely glossed over. This pipeline has been on the negotiating table since 2014. Over a decade of talks. Over a decade of Russian optimism. Over a decade of China finding reasons to wait. Why has China kept waiting? Because every year Russia waits, Russia's alternatives shrink. Every year China waits, China's leverage grows. China has consistently demanded pricing at levels Russia considers too low. Russia needs the pipeline so badly that it has been forced to gradually accept worse terms. China has been running a slow-motion negotiation designed to extract maximum concessions from a partner with no exit option. And this visit produced no final deal. Both sides signed a joint statement. Both sides signed 20 agreements on technology, trade, and cultural cooperation. Both sides extended their friendship treaty. The power of Siberia 2? Still in progress, still being negotiated, still on China's timeline, not Russia's. Now let's talk about what actually was signed, because this is the part of this story that should make every American, every European, and every leader in the Indo-Pacific sit up and pay very close attention. Putin and Xi did not just sign trade agreements on Wednesday. They signed a 47-page joint statement, and alongside it, a separate declaration calling for a multipolar world order. Let's be precise about what that means. A multipolar world order is diplomatic language for the post-World War II system, built by American power, enforced by American alliances, anchored in American institutions, is over. Or at least should be over, and we, Russia and China, are going to build something to replace it. This is not a trade document. This is not an energy agreement. This is a formal declaration of an alternative global architecture. And it was signed while the world was still processing photographs of Donald Trump shaking Xi Jinping's hand in the same building 6 days earlier. Think about the timing. Trump visited Beijing on May 13th through 15th. Trump's summit produced a vague $17 billion agricultural commitment that China has not fully confirmed. Trump's summit produced no progress on Taiwan, no progress on Iran, no resolution on tariffs. Trump's White House fact sheet and China's Ministry of Commerce readout couldn't even agree on what was discussed. Putin visited Beijing on May 19th. Putin's summit produced 20 signed agreements, a 47-page joint statement, a declaration on restructuring the world order, and an invitation for Xi to visit Moscow next year. 2 presidents, 1 city, 1 week. One came as a businessman hoping for deals. One came as an ideological partner building a new world. Xi received them both, smiled for both cameras, and walked away with leverage over both. And now here is the detail that sent shockwaves through foreign policy circles. The detail that almost nobody covered. During Trump's visit to Beijing, inside the Zhongnanhai leadership compound, behind closed doors, Xi Jinping looked at Donald Trump and said something remarkable. According to the Financial Times, citing sources directly familiar with that conversation, Xi told Trump that Putin may end up regretting the war in Ukraine. Let that land. China's leader, Russia's closest strategic partner, the man who calls Putin dear friend, the man who has never once condemned the invasion of Ukraine, privately told the American president that Putin might regret it. That is not the statement of an unconditional ally. That is the statement of a patron who has privately concluded his client made a strategic error, but is not ready to say so publicly because the relationship is still too useful. China has bought $367 billion in Russian energy since 2022. China has provided dual-use technology components that Russia denies receiving but uses in its weapons. China has given Russia economic oxygen to continue a war that has now cost hundreds of thousands of lives. And behind closed doors, China's leader is telling the American president that Putin might regret it. China is not Russia's ally in the traditional sense. China is Russia's manager. And managers don't grieve when the help has problems. They use those problems as leverage. Here is the energy mathematics that is reshaping every decision in this story. Before the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran sealed off the Strait of Hormuz, China was importing roughly 50% of its crude oil and 30% of its liquefied natural gas through that single choke point. One war, one strait, Half of China's oil supply suddenly at risk. China immediately turned north. China's imports of Russian liquefied natural gas jumped 32% from March to April 2026, the month the Iran war started. Russian ESPO crude surged 36% in the same period, the highest volume of that import in 2 years. Russia didn't engineer this. Russia got lucky. The Iran war created an energy emergency for China, and Russia was the nearest available alternative with massive spare capacity sitting in frozen pipelines. Putin arrived in Beijing at the single most advantageous energy moment Russia has had since the Ukraine war began. And he still couldn't close the Siberia 2 deal. That tells you everything about the true balance of power in this relationship. China needed the energy. China was increasing purchases. China was running the numbers on Siberia 2, and China still didn't say yes, because China knew Putin had nowhere else to go, and every additional day of need is another day of Chinese negotiating leverage. There is one more piece of this story that is receiving almost no serious analysis anywhere. Russia, China, and North Korea. All three countries are now operating as interlocking partners in ways that would have seemed unthinkable a decade ago. North Korea has been supplying Russia with artillery shells and ballistic missiles for use in Ukraine, a fact confirmed by South Korean, American, and European intelligence agencies. In exchange, Russia has been providing North Korea with advanced military technology, satellite access, and diplomatic cover. And China? China is the economic lifeblood of North Korea. Without Chinese trade, North Korean stability collapses within months. So here's what this triangle actually looks like. China funds North Korea. North Korea arms Russia. Russia fights a war that keeps America distracted in Europe. America distracted in Europe means America less focused on Taiwan, less focused on the South China Sea, less focused on the Indo-Pacific competition that China considers its primary strategic theater. Every Russian shell fired in Ukraine is, in a deeply structural sense, funded indirectly by Chinese economic support, and serves Chinese strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific. That is not a coincidence. That is the architecture of a new axis, not formally declared, not named, but functionally operating. Let's be fair. Let's zoom out. Because intellectual honesty requires acknowledging what is real and what is theater. The 20 agreements signed this week are real. Technology cooperation, sustainable trade, joint research institutes. These are concrete, functioning programs that benefit both countries. Russia's energy revenues from China are real. They are keeping the Russian economy from collapsing under sanctions. That is a genuine strategic success for Moscow. And the symbolic power of two nuclear powers, together controlling a permanent veto at the UN Security Council, signing a joint declaration for a new world order, should not be dismissed as empty performance. Symbols matter in geopolitics. The declaration matters. But here is the honest scorecard. Russia got a revenue lifeline, diplomatic visibility, 20 signed agreements, an extended friendship treaty, symbolic solidarity. China got a dependent energy supplier locked into below-market prices, a grateful military partner supplying intelligence and technology, permanent leverage over a nuclear power, positioning as the world's indispensable diplomatic host, and a pipeline negotiation still running on Beijing's timeline. One side walked away with tools. The other side walked away with survival. That is the true picture underneath the red carpet, the national anthems, and the 47-page joint statement. Here is the framework for what to watch as this story develops. Watch the power of Siberia 2. If China signs a final agreement in the next 90 days, Russia will have won something real. If negotiation drags into 2027, it means China is still extracting concessions. Watch Russian energy pricing. The discount China pays for Russian oil is not publicly disclosed in full, but industry analysts track it. If the discount deepens, Russia's desperation is growing. Watch what China does on Ukraine. Xi privately told Trump that Putin might regret the war. If China ever applies actual pressure on Moscow to negotiate, not just words but trade leverage, the entire dynamic changes overnight. Watch North Korea. If North Korean weapons transfers to Russia continue and China does nothing, the triangle is hardening. If China pulls back on North Korea, it's a signal Beijing is recalibrating its risk tolerance. And watch the 47-page statement. Declarations matter only when they're followed by actions. Watch whether China and Russia actually build the institutions they declared, or whether this document becomes another promise that dissolves under geopolitical pressure. Putin flew to Beijing this week and received a red carpet. He got a military band and children waving flags. He got 20 agreements and a friendship treaty extension. He got the photographs. What he didn't get was the pipeline. What he didn't get was confirmed pricing. What he didn't get was an ally, he got a patron. And the patron decided once again that it wasn't quite time to give Russia everything it came for. Beijing waited in 2022. Beijing waited in 2023. Beijing waited in 2024. Beijing waited again this week. Because when you hold all the cards, you never have to rush. If this breakdown gave you something the headlines didn't, subscribe right now. This channel exists to go beneath the announcement, past the ceremony, and into the actual power mathematics that determine what happens to the world's economies, alliances, and your future. Share this with someone who still thinks Russia and China are equal partners. The data says something very different. And drop a comment below. Do you think Putin will ever get the Siberia 2 pipeline on his terms? Yes or no? Let's see where this audience stands. This story is not over. It has entered its most consequential phase.